The year is 2013. The place is the cradle of humankind, South Africa, a landscape already steeped in the bones of our dawn. But this discovery would shatter the elegant, linear story of human evolution we thought we knew. It began in the profound, suffocating darkness of the rising star cave system. To reach the deepest chamber, called Dinaledi, you must pass through a chute so narrow, just 18 centimeters wide, that it was named Superman's Crawl. It was here, in this nearly inaccessible subterranean void, that the first bones of Homo Naledi were found. They weren't just a handful of fragments. They were a torrent, 1,550 specimens, representing at least 15 individuals, infants, children, adults, and the elderly. It was a massive, unprecedented treasure trove, yet every bone posed a question more profound than the last. The initial shock was their size. They were small, averaging about 4 feet, 9 inches tall, and weighing less than 90 pounds. They were slight, almost delicate, but the true astonishment was their head. The Homo Naledi brain was tiny, holding a volume of just 465, 610 / text, cm, $3. To put that in perspective, the modern human brain is more than twice that size. Their small heads seem to place them squarely in the deep past, alongside the ancient Australopithecus, our distant, ape-like ancestors. 300,000 years ago, evolution made a promise. Bigger brains meant survival. It was the rule. Every human ancestor from that era was on the unstoppable march toward complexity, leaving the small-headed past behind. Then they found the bones. But then came the contradiction. Their feet and hands told a different story. Their legs were long, built for a human-like stride, suggesting they could cover long distances on the open African plains, much like Homo erectus, the great travelers of the Old World. Their wrists, palms, and thumbs were sophisticated, built for the dexterity required to grasp and manipulate tools. Homo Naledi was a mosaic, a patchwork of the extremely ancient and the startlingly modern. They had the tiny brain of a figure from 2 million years ago, but the hands and posture of a creature only moments before us. They shouldn't exist, not in this configuration, and certainly not when they did. For a long time, the narrative of human history was simple. Homo habilis led to Homo erectus, which led to us. It was a single, glorious march toward bigger brains and greater intelligence. But H. Naledi's discovery, initially undated, was a ghost from the past, appearing to haunt the present. Were they a forgotten line that survived against all odds? Or were they a brutal reminder that the rules of evolution are always more complex, more chaotic, and ultimately more humbling than we care to admit? The bones were a challenge not just to science but to our very idea of what it means to be human. To understand the absurdity of Homo Naledi's existence, we must look at the world they inhabited when their remains were finally dated. The timeline revealed they lived between 335, 000 and 236, 000 years ago. This was the height of human cognitive expansion, the era of the giants. Across Eurasia, the Neanderthals were flourishing. They were robust, powerful, and possessed brains as large as or even larger than our own. They mastered fire, cared for their sick, and created art. Their secretive cousins, the Denisovans, ranged across Asia, navigating harsh climates and demonstrating advanced survival skills. They were the apex survivors. Deep within a South African cave system, a discovery was made that tore that rule apart. Not the giants who hunted mammoths, not the innovators who mastered fire, but something small, slight, and impossibly ancient. Over 15 individuals, placed meticulously in the darkest chamber. A species of human that should have vanished long before, yet persisted. They were small-brained, almost indistinguishable from apes in their build, yet they possessed a baffling capacity for ritual. What if the darkest, tightest place on Earth held the secret to humanity that we were never meant to find? What if our ancestors were not the only ones capable of grief? H. Erectus, though older, was a constant shadow in parts of the world, having spread from Africa deep into Asia, leaving behind sophisticated Acheulean stone tools. They were the first true endurance runners, with massive bodies and the ability to control their environment. While the Neanderthals were painting great, thundering bisons on the walls of sunlit caves, the Neanderthals were flourishing. Even the other oddity of the genus, Homo floriensis. The hobbit, from Indonesia, had shrunk in size, a predictable evolutionary response to island isolation. They were small, but they, too, used advanced tools. Homo Naledi was living in a world defined by massive brains, complex technology, and global migration. Yet they were a shadow of that progress. They were like a quiet, small-town echo in the middle of a bustling global metropolis. They had the opportunity to grow, to innovate, to expand their cranial capacity, but they didn't. They persisted in their ancient form. This is the core mystery. How could a species that looked like a deep ancestor survive for hundreds of thousands of years in the same moment as the largest, most successful brains evolution had ever produced? And why were they here, deep in the darkest, most terrifying place in the cave, piled together? The answers, as the excavation continued, would not only rewrite the history books but would force us to confront the terrifying possibility that intelligence is not the only key to immortality. The initial shock of the Homo Naledi find gave way to an obsession. For the scientists, the sheer number of bones, the largest hominin cache ever found in Africa, was a gift. But it was also a heavy, profound obligation. They had to know not just what Homo Naledi was, but why they were here, packed into the absolute isolation of the Dinaledi Chamber. Imagine the scene. A place so deep, so remote, that the only light ever seen was the flickering flame carried by the living creature who made the final, terrifying journey into the void. This was not a campsite. This was not a place where natural predators dragged their prey. There were no signs of feeding, no tooth marks, and critically, no evidence of tools left behind. No scrapers, no hand axes, nothing to suggest a permanent presence. The only reasonable conclusion, slowly and controversially forming in the minds of the excavators, was that the bodies had been deliberately placed. Think of the journey itself, a literal descent into the Earth's abyss. To reach the chamber, an individual $H. Naledi was slight, but still a living, breathing being, would have had to navigate hundreds of feet of tight, winding passages, culminating in the infamous $18 centimeter crawl. The body being carried, heavy with the dead weight of a collapsed life, would have been an immense, terrifying struggle. They would have needed light, perhaps a torch made of dry wood or grass, the flames dancing and casting grotesque shadows on the wet, limestone walls. This act would have demanded intentionality, planning, and a profound, conscious effort. And for what? The great evolutionary assumption had always been this: ritual equals intellect. Only creatures with a large, complex brain, the Homo sapiens, the Neanderthals, were capable of abstract thought, of feeling grief deep enough to necessitate a dedicated rite for the dead. Burial, or any deliberate act of placement, was considered the signature of humanity. It was the moment we stepped away from the animal kingdom. But here, $H. Naledi had placed 15 of their dead in a mass, yet organized, grave. If they did this, the entire evolutionary timeline of human consciousness had to be thrown out. The scientific community reacted with a mixture of awe and immediate, sharp skepticism. "It must be a trap," the critics whispered. "There must be another way. Perhaps a fissure opened up, and the bodies fell in? Perhaps water currents washed them there over millennia?" But the geological evidence was damning. The cave was stable. The bodies were intact, articulating precisely as if they had been gently placed, not violently washed or dropped. The mystery deepened into a kind of scientific panic. If a species with a brain no bigger than an orange could perform a sacred ritual, what was the real measure of a soul? To understand the emotional turmoil this caused, you must step back into Homo Naledi's existence in the Middle Pleistocene. Imagine their everyday life. They were efficient walkers, built for long-distance travel across the savannas. Yet their fingers and curved toes strongly suggested they were skilled climbers. better adapted to scaling trees than the Homo species around them. They lived in the shadow of the great Homo erectus bands, who marched across continents, and perhaps even crossed paths with early Homo sapiens groups, who were already forging the first simple tools of the Middle Stone Age. H Naledi was trapped between two worlds. In their environment, they were essentially the evolutionary underdog. Their small stature and brain size made them seem like easy prey, a footnote in history that should have been erased by the dominant, brain-heavy lineages. They persisted not through overwhelming power or intellect, but through sheer, tenacious adaptation. They were able to use their mosaic anatomy, part climber, part walker, to exploit niches that their more specialized cousins ignored. They were the ultimate survivors by being the ultimate generalists, blending into the background while the giants clashed. The absurdity lay in their resilience. Why didn't they evolve a bigger brain? Why remain so close to the physical blueprint of Australopithecus for so long? The existence of H Naledi suggested a terrifying truth. Evolutionary advantage is not a straight line. A small brain was not a handicap if it was enough. And their survival, in the face of the massive-brained Neanderthals and early modern humans, made the deliberate burials all the more agonizingly complex. If they were sophisticated enough to grieve, why were they so small-brained? The paradox was suffocating. The investigation pressed deeper, beyond the bones, into the physical structure of the cave itself. The excavators began mapping the passages leading toward the Dinaledi Chamber, following the same desperate, torchlit path that H Naledi had taken hundreds of thousands of years ago. It was in this narrow, terrifying corridor, the very throat of the cave, that the most controversial, emotionally charged discovery was made. Scratched into the pale rock walls, faint but unmistakable, were patterns, crosshatched designs, simple geometric shapes etched into the limestone. These were not tool marks or natural erosion. They were intentionally carved signs, and they were found in direct proximity to the passage leading to the dead. The scientific implication was seismic. If these carvings were made by Homo Naledi, it meant they didn't just perform burial rites. They were capable of symbolic communication. This tiny-brained species, living in the age of the great hunter-gatherers, was potentially performing the very act that defines modern human cognition: art and symbol creation. The critics went ballistic. It's impossible. It's just scratches. It must be contamination from Homo sapiens, who found the cave later. But the dating and the location, deep in the system, right at the threshold of the burial chamber, made external contamination highly unlikely. Only H Naledi had left bones in this terrifying abyss. The pressure mounted. The team had proposed that a creature with the brain size of a gorilla was not only capable of ritual, but of carving meaning into stone, right alongside the early Homo sapiens who were making their first cave paintings thousands of miles away. This was no longer just about a small-brained hominin. This was about the foundation of human dignity and intelligence. The discovery suggested that cognitive complexity wasn't tied solely to cranial volume. It suggested that a small-brained lineage, which should have been eliminated by the grand march of evolution, had somehow developed a spark of soul, a capacity for deep, profound meaning that we had reserved only for ourselves. The stage was set for a confrontation, the evidence of the dead against the stubborn arrogance of the living. The quiet, dark secret of the Dinaledi Chamber was about to explode into the public light, threatening to rewrite the very definition of Homo. The world was forced to confront an uncomfortable truth. Perhaps Homo Naledi was. The controversy surrounding Homo Naledi was not just an academic debate. It became a global media firestorm, a trial of scientific arrogance versus unsettling evidence. The antagonist was not a person, but an entrenched, centuries-old narrative. The belief that large brains are the sole prerequisite for human dignity, for ritual, for a soul. The climax arrived in two devastating waves, each designed to dismantle that narrative piece by piece, driven by the sheer weight of the bones from the Dinaledi Chamber. The first wave was the announcement of the intentional placement. The research team, having meticulously ruled out every conceivable natural explanation, water flow, collapse, predator activity, presented their findings to the world. Imagine the atmosphere in that auditorium. Paleontologists, evolutionary biologists, and anthropologists, the high priests of human origins, sat ready to strike down what they viewed as a sensational, unfounded claim. They were convinced the answer lay in geology, in chance, not in the profound grief of a small-brained creature. The evidence presented was cold, hard, and unforgiving. The bodies were not randomly scattered. They were found in a limited depression in the cave floor, often in tight clusters. Most damningly, they exhibited a lack of orientation. Had they been washed in by water, they would have been aligned with the flow. Had they fallen, they would have shown signs of breakage. But these fragile remains were almost pristine, placed as if in a sleep. The emotional core of the presentation was the sheer absurdity of the effort. The scientists projected a map of the rising star cave. They detailed the journey, the $80 meter crawl, the vertical shaft, the final, terrifying $18 centimeter squeeze. They calculated the energy expenditure, the necessity of a sustained light source, the absolute commitment required. A creature dragging a corpse, a beloved mother, a revered elder, a lost child, into that black, suffocating void was not acting on instinct. It was acting on a sense of duty, on love, or on fear of the afterlife. The air was thick with frustrated disbelief. One prominent critic stood up, arguing with palpable anger that this was a desperate attempt to elevate a primitive hominin. You are claiming Homo Naledi had the cognitive capacity for burial, with a brain the size of an orange. That is a profound absurdity. This goes against everything we know about the progression from Homo erectus to us. But the lead researchers delivered the crushing blow, turning the critic's own logic against him. If the Homo Naledi individuals did not intentionally take the bodies into this chamber, then how else did they get there? Why are there no other species represented? Why is there no evidence of any material culture from any other hominin? The easiest conclusion, the one that requires the fewest geological miracles, is the hardest to accept. They cared enough to carry their dead. The humiliation for the established dogma was complete. The Homo Naledi bones, silent $4,300,000 years, had finally spoken, demanding that the scientific world expand its definition of the Homo genus to include the capacity for ritual. The second, even more potent wave of confrontation came with the announcement of the alleged rock carvings. This moved the debate from grief to symbolism, the hallmark of modern human behavior. The carvings, those simple crosshatched designs, were presented not as art, but as markers. They were found at the narrowest, most dangerous choke points leading to the chamber. The implication was profound. These were perhaps signposts, a rudimentary language or directional signal to help the living navigate the burial path. If this were true, Homo Naledi wasn't just feeling grief. They were conceptualizing space and communicating meaning in a way previously reserved for their massive-brained contemporaries, the Neanderthals and early Homo sapiens. The frustration in the room turned to emotional fury. The opposition was cornered. To accept the carvings was to accept that H. Naledi had achieved symbolic complexity without the accompanying brain evolution that science had long deemed mandatory. It was a direct, cruel contradiction of the belief that evolutionary fitness was measured only in cranial volume. The final, devastating emotional impact came from considering the environment. While the Neanderthals were painting great, thundering bisons on the walls of sunlit caves, H. Naledi was etching a simple geometric scratch in the absolute, lightless dark, a desperate whisper of communication to those who followed. It was a humble, silent act of profound meaning, performed in the most terrifying place they could conceive of. The confrontation ended not with cheers, but with a stunned silence. The established view, the one that placed Homo sapiens and their large-brained cousins atop the cognitive ladder, had been publicly exposed as potentially flawed, biased by size, and fundamentally arrogant. The small, slight, archaic figure of Homo Naledi had performed a colossal act of defiance. They proved that the capacity for a soul is not limited by the architecture of the skull, but by the will of the heart. The question was no longer, how did $Homo / Naledi survive? But rather, if they could do this, what other fundamental truths about humanity have we blindly overlooked? The explosion of controversy eventually settled into a profound, uncomfortable realization. The bones of Homo / Naledi, once dismissed as an anomaly or a mistake, became a mirror reflecting the biases and arrogance of our own species. The scientists were forced to accept the most difficult truth. $H / Naledi had fundamentally revised the equation of humanity. The humiliation of the algorithm. The long-term impact of the discovery was the dethroning of the brain. For decades, the story of evolution was told as a mathematical progression. $400 / text, cm, $3. Then $800 / text, cm, $3. Then $1, 300 / text, cm, $3. The larger the cranial capacity, the higher the species was placed on the evolutionary ladder. This was the algorithm of success. Homo / Naledi was the bug in the code. Here was a species, coexisting with early Homo / sapiens and the giant-brained Neanderthals, that deliberately ignored the rule. They did not strive for larger heads. They maintained the Australopithecus like brain size for a staggering 250,000 years, long after their distant cousins, Homo / erectus had developed far more advanced tool-making and hunting strategies. This single fact, the persistence of the small brain in the midst of cognitive expansion, changed everything. It shattered the comfortable notion that a large brain was a mandatory evolutionary advantage. $H / Naledi strategy was not expansion, but optimization. Their brain, though small, was organized in a way that seemed to mimic the structure of their larger-brained contemporaries. They had a complex structure, not just a smaller volume. They proved that cognitive complexity is not a universal constant tied to size, but a function of internal architecture and environmental necessity. This realization was immensely humbling. It meant that our direct ancestors, the early Homo / sapiens might have looked down upon H / Naledi as primitive and doomed, yet the small-brained species had achieved the emotional depth of ritual and the technological feat of long-term survival in their own unique way. The evolutionary journey, it turned out, was not a ladder leading to us, but a vast, sprawling, competitive bush where diverse forms of humanity experimented with life, side by side. The coexistence of ghosts. The new perspective H / Naledi afforded us illuminated the true complexity of the Middle Pleistocene. It was a time of evolutionary abundance and deep contrast. While the sophisticated Neanderthals in Europe were mastering fire control, tailoring clothes, and developing complex social structures, all fueled by their massive brains, Homo / Naledi was quietly surviving in the African subcontinent, perhaps using their unique climbing ability to escape the pressures of the open savanna. They demonstrated that there were multiple, equally valid paths to survival, power and intellect for the Neanderthals versus tenacity and niche adaptation for H / Naledi. The ultimate irony lies in their fates. While the Neanderthals eventually vanished, absorbed or outcompeted by the rapidly expanding Homo / sapiens H / Naledi persisted until relatively recently on the timeline. They held their ancient form, an echo of the deep past, right up to the moment that early modern humans were spreading across Africa. They were ghosts of the genus Homo, living alongside the future. The discovery forces us to imagine the terrifying moment of encounter. What did a slight $4 foot $9 inch Homo / Naledi think when they saw a robust, tall Homo / sapiens or a Neanderthal? Did they see a family member or a monstrous evolutionary rival? The long-term consequence of H / Naledi is the profound realization that for hundreds of thousands of years, the definition of humanity was fluid, shared, and competitive, populated by a menagerie of forms, the giants, the hobbits, and the tenacious mourners of the deep caves. The final, dark journey. The true emotional weight of the Homo / Naledi story, the part that lingers long after the scientific data is filed, resides in that final, terrible act of deliberate placement. Forget the controversial carvings for a moment and focus on the sheer, impossible commitment of the living. To carry a body is a heavy burden, demanding immense physical and emotional strength. To carry that body through the dark, through a passage so tight that it strips the flesh from your own bones, is an act that defies logic and survival instinct. It is an act of pure, unadulterated devotion. Imagine the last survivor, the one tasked with the final descent. They would have stood at the mouth of the chamber, holding the flickering light, watching the life drain from the face of their loved one, knowing the agonizing journey ahead. They would have experienced a grief so deep that it commanded them to ignore the primal fear of the dark, the fear of claustrophobia, and the immediate, crippling exhaustion. This was not burial as we know it, neatly dug graves in the earth. This was a physical, agonizing tribute to connection. They weren't hiding the dead. They were gifting them to the deepest, most sacred silence the earth could offer. The chamber became a cathedral of memory, a place where their collective identity was preserved, away from the scavengers and the destructive forces of the surface. This act, performed by creatures with hands capable of complex tool use but a brain that science deemed too small for the task, fundamentally challenges our narrative. It suggests that the most profound human behaviors, love, mourning, and the search for meaning, are not inventions of high intellect, but are intrinsic primal necessities that emerged far earlier and in far simpler forms than we ever dared to believe. The lesson of $Homo_Naledi is one of humility. We are taught that our large brain is the source of all our triumphs, our morality, and our soul. But $H_Naledi silently endured for an epoch, proving that the greatest evolutionary advantage is not the ability to dominate, but the ability to persist, and that the smallest among us can still carry the heaviest weight of grief. The Dinaledi Chamber is not just a paleontological site. It is a monument to the forgotten forms of humanity, a final resting place that whispers a powerful truth across the ages. If the small, tenacious Homo_Naledi were capable of such profound care in the absolute dark, what acts of soul are we, the large-brained inheritors of the world, still too arrogant to see in others, and in ourselves?